Welcome to Season 2, Episode 3 of the SoothSight Podcast. I first want to apologize to our longtime viewers for the 4-month gap since our last interview. I've had severe ulcers on my vocal cords in the last few months and just started getting my voice back this week. But I appreciate all of the kind messages, and we should be back for good for now. So with that said, our guest today is one of the most influential thinkers in climate science, Dr. Judith Curry, a distinguished atmospheric scientist whose career has shaped our understanding of extreme weather, climate dynamics, prediction, and risk science. Dr. Curry received her PhD in geophysical sciences from the University of Chicago and is Professor Emerita at the Georgia Institute of Technology, where she served 13 years as Chair of Earth and Atmospheric Sciences. She is a fellow of the American Meteorological Society, the American Association for the Advancement of Science, and the American Geophysical Union, a member of the American Academy of Sciences and Letters, and her contributions to climate research have earned her the prestigious Henry J. Houghton Research Award. After decades of groundbreaking research, she co-founded Climate Forecast Applications Network, a pioneering organization that transforms cutting-edge climate science into powerful real-world solutions for industries and policymakers navigating weather and climate risk. Dr. Curry is a highly respected voice in the science policy interface that has testified before Congress at least a dozen times, advised organizations like NASA and the Department of Energy, and that continues to foster open discourse through her influential blog, Climate, Etc. On a personal note, I have followed Dr. Curry's work for years, and her latest book, Climate Uncertainty and Risk, is a must-read, not just for climate scientists, but for business leaders, data scientists, and really anyone who wants to cut through the noise and truly understand the complexities of this subject. Our goal today is to have an honest, fact-based conversation about climate science, free from political spin, so we can better understand the realities of our changing world and its impact on business, innovation, risk management, and the decisions that will shape our future. It is an absolute pleasure to welcome you, Dr. Curry, and thank you for joining us.
Well, thanks, Chris. It's always a pleasure to talk with you.
So we'll start strong. So you distinguish between climate change and climate variability. It's obviously a distinction that often gets lost in public discourse. You specifically note that focusing too narrowly on human-caused global warming can obscure important short-term and regional climate fluctuations. How do you think this impacts climate forecasting, and how should businesses account for these variations in their climate risk strategies?
Well, the Earth's climate has always been changing from a range of natural factors. But several decades ago, the UN defined climate change as being caused by humans, with the term climate variability used for natural variability. But in the popular discourse, climate variability is rarely mentioned, and all of climate change is now assumed to be human-caused. In my interactions with business, they're mostly interested in how the climate might vary or change on timescales of 5 to 50 years. At timescales less than 50 years, natural climate variability dominates over the slow creep of global warming, particularly in terms of extreme weather events. Climate models do a poor job of predicting the natural internal variability of ocean circulations, which dominates climate and extreme weather on regional and decadal timescales. Nevertheless, there are climate companies out there that sell the downscaled outputs of global climate models to businesses and governments and other decision makers. But this approach is simply not fit for the purpose of projecting regional decadal climate variability, and hence useless for risk management of the type that businesses face. However, this approach has been very useful for ticking off the boxes for an ESG report, if nothing else. To address this challenge, my company, Climate Forecast Applications Network, has developed a network-based approach that incorporates scenarios of natural climate variability along with human-caused climate change. And this approach is described in broad terms in chapters 8 and 9 of my book, climate uncertainty and risk.
To, I guess, pick up on that, the natural climate variability that's driven by factors like solar cycles, cloud cover, and oceanic patterns plays a major role in shaping climate trends. So how do you assess the weighting of human-derived CO2 in climate models relative to these natural drivers? And do current modeling approaches accurately capture this balance? I guess the last question there would be, how should businesses think about climate risk projections when they're making long-term strategic decisions?
Okay. Current climate model projections for the 21st century use a single scenario of solar variability and a single scenario of volcanic eruption. Ensemble simulations are used to produce different realizations of the ocean circulation patterns, because after all, we have a chaotic system. Although nearly all of the models produce too little variability at multi-decadal and longer timescales. The approach that my company uses is to develop a range of different scenarios for regional climate change. And these scenarios include different magnitudes of all the relevant factors, including volcanic eruptions and solar variations, as well as human-caused climate change. However, the collection of these scenarios don't produce probabilities. What they do is provide insights into the range of plausible scenarios and the plausible worst-case scenario. And these scenarios are useful for stress testing infrastructure, logistics, and a range of other decisions. But we need to face that we don't know how the climate of the 21st century will play out. I advise my clients to use a framework of robust decision-making, which emphasizes decisions that work well across a range of plausible future scenarios. Robust strategies include no regrets, reversible and flexible decisions, safety margin decisions, and decisions with reduced time horizons.
When you're discussing climate heretics, again, I'm going to refer a lot back to the book because I just got through it last week, but great book. But when you're talking about climate heretics and the challenges of questioning pseudoscientific mainstream narratives, you argue that scientific skepticism is fundamental to progress. In AI and data science, we also face skepticism around model reliability and bias. How do you think climate scientists can foster, say, a more open and constructive debate about uncertainty while ensuring that predictions still remain transparent and useful?
Well, climate model projections are fairly transparent, and most of them are well documented and publicly available. But for most applications, they are simply not fit for purpose. And the most recent IPCC assessment report clearly acknowledges this. But that doesn't stop climate scientists and private sector companies from pushing these models and decision makers from making impossible demands regarding precision and accuracy. Because the time horizon of these projections is decades, decision makers don't get the same kind of feedback that they get from using a weather forecast. So it's much easier for decision makers to get led astray by a wildly inaccurate long-term climate prediction. With regard to the behavior of climate scientists, their professional and financial incentives have been to sound the alarm and push the climate models. Unfortunately, we're not going to see this change until the incentives change.
You discuss how expertise is often presented as authoritative, yet expert predictions, particularly in climate science, are fraught with uncertainty. Given the historical failures of certain expert-driven policy decisions, how should models be designed to communicate confidence levels and uncertainty in climate risk assessments for businesses?
Climate models simply are not good enough for a traditional cost-benefit analysis. The collection of global climate model simulations that are publicly available, the so-called CMIP simulations, don't adequately explore all of the different types of uncertainties. for the simple reason that the models are too computationally expensive to fully explore their uncertainties. Simpler models can be useful in more fully exploring certain types of uncertainties, and this includes the data-driven network approach used by my company. In principle, AI climate models that are computationally efficient could be used to more broadly explore the uncertainties. However, figuring out how to effectively use AI in climate modeling is still in its infancy. The only way to train an AI climate model right now is on the existing outputs of climate models, which, as you've heard, have numerous inadequacies. In terms of how the 21st century climate will play out, I would characterize the situation as deep uncertainty. Decisions for most businesses are regional, even if the company has a global scope. Given this level of uncertainty, I think the strategy right now is a regional data-driven network-based scenario approach that my company is using.
In your book, you also introduce this concept of uncertainty monster in climate science. Can you define that for our audience and talk about the hazards of overconfidence when tackling complex problems like climate forecasting and business decision making?
Well, it's easy to make decisions if the facts are clear and unambiguous. But decisions are much more challenging when you're dealing with a complex system and uncertainties. The uncertainty monster is about our discomfort from the confusion and ambiguity that's associated with knowledge versus ignorance, facts versus values, prediction versus speculation, and science versus policy. Strategies to tame the uncertainty monster, such as enforcing a manufactured consensus, lead to overconfidence and bad decisions. In robust decision-making strategies, uncertainty assessments are regarded as key inputs into decision-making, not a source of discomfort. The challenge is then to select the appropriate decision-making framework for the level of uncertainty that you're facing.
You brought up AI, and it's starting to make, let's say, some strides in weather forecasting. However, its role in long-term climate predictions remains less clear, right? So what do you see as the biggest challenges in applying AI to climate forecasting beyond short-term weather prediction? And where do you think industry-driven innovation can have the most impact in terms of improving climate risk assessments for businesses or policymakers?
Well, AI models need data for training. AI models for weather forecasting are using the reanalysis data sets, which are derived from the data assimilation process of the weather forecasting cycle. These reanalysis data sets go back fairly reliably to 1950. So 40 to 80 years of data seems to be adequate for training the weather forecast models. But for seasonal to interannual climate forecasts, 40 to 80 years of data may be barely adequate for developing useful AI models. Extending the reanalyses backwards in time to the 19th century could help the AI models predict some basic signals like El Nino. But if you're trying to make a projection decades to centuries in the future, then the observational data sets simply are not adequate. Several climate modeling groups are using long-term, large ensemble simulations of their global climate models as the data basis for training an AI climate model. The challenge is for the global model to adequately simulate the natural internal climate variability associated with the large-scale ocean oscillations. In my assessment, the GFDL model is the best one for this, and I'm watching their efforts closely. However, a problem is that the GFDL model is running too hot with a very large sensitivity to increases in CO2. So there really isn't a perfect model to do this kind of training. So for AI models to be useful for forecasting at whatever time horizon, ensemble approaches are needed to help quantify the uncertainty in the forecast. And such ensemble forecasts are just now becoming available for operational AI-based weather forecasting. So the AI revolution in weather and climate prediction, while very exciting, is still in its early days.
I know you consult with many of the largest businesses in the world, and there's many different industries from logistic to agriculture that rely on dependable weather and climate forecasting. What innovations do you see emerging in the space, especially in the context of rethinking the use of climate models when it comes to regional and local scale projections? And how do you see AI and big data helping either now or potentially in the future in this regard?
On the weather forecasting scale, my company is at the forefront in integrating AI-based extreme weather modules with ensemble weather forecasts. We currently have a small business innovation and research grant from NOAA to develop this capability. Our AI modules include rapid intensification of hurricanes, tornadoes, hail, and severe convective wind gusts. These models can be used with the dynamical weather forecast models as well as the AI weather models. These extreme event modules require data sets for training, which can be challenging because such events are relatively infrequent and can be small scale. Building these extreme event data sets is challenging. It requires merging of numerous surface-based data sets, interpreting radar returns, and satellite data for some event types. Another exciting development comes from Spire and NVIDIA, who just issued a press release today. They're using data from Spire's constellation of small satellites in advanced data assimilation methods for NVIDIA's AI weather model. I mean, I can't wait to see what that one looks like. Many decisions require seasonal climate forecasts. The approach used by my company mines the global data sets, the reanalysis data sets for relevant signals, and then we develop forecasts using statistical analysis of the relevant predictors, which also provides an uncertainty estimate. In principle, our approach to seasonal forecasting could use ML or AI methods. I'm trying to figure out a way to automate what goes on in the head of my seasonal forecaster, who's an expert in climate dynamics, in developing these linkages that provide the basis for his forecasts. And to me, this is a reminder that to be effective, artificial intelligence models need to also include the best human intelligence. And some of these companies are saying, oh, I can do an AI weather model, but they're sort of lacking the weather dynamics expertise that I think the best models are going to come from groups who really understand this.
Yeah, it's definitely an area that you need domain expertise, right? It's not a purely data-driven kind of thing. In your book, you discuss extreme weather events, and businesses are increasingly turning to AI-powered risk analytics to predict and mitigate supply chain disruptions that are caused by climate variability. On what time scale do you think these AI-driven approaches are most effective then? Is it short-term forecasting, i.e., days to weeks, or seasonal outlooks, or long-term climate projections? And then even beyond forecasting, what approaches can businesses, what approaches can improve business resilience, and how should companies integrate uncertainty into their planning models?
Well, the risk of supply chain disruptions by extreme weather can be anticipated on timescales up to a week. Potential extreme events can be identified, and then closer to the possible events, probabilities become more meaningful. And within a day or two, the magnitude of the event becomes apparent. On seasonal timescales, drought is an example where there is some predictability. I recall 2 projects that I did in Australia where seasonal predictions were useful for logistics. One was predicting rainfall and river flow for the transport of LNG in a river whose level is sometimes too low. Another was to predict the need for operation of desalination plants. Another example is the seasonal prediction of regional Arctic sea ice extent for shipping. On longer time scales, scenarios of local sea level rise at coastal ports may be of some relevance for long-term logistical planning. But in terms of uncertainty, on the weather time scale, say we're talking about a hurricane, my company provides ensemble forecasts, which of the track and the intensity and whatever. So you have a range of, it reflects the range of uncertainty, and then companies take these simulations and use them to derive their decision making models, like an outage model for electric utilities or whatever. So the ensemble simulations, just taking the mean or using one simulation doesn't really help you with the uncertainty, but the ensemble can really help you with the uncertainty.
Earlier, you were advocating for, correct me if I misunderstood, but you're advocating for regional risk assessments rather than broad global policies. So how should AI and things like geospatial analytics be used to tailor climate adaptation strategies for industries, let's say manufacturing and transportation, based on localized risk rather than sweeping global targets?
Well, the only decision that relates to global predictions is the UN net zero policy regarding elimination of fossil fuel use. All other decisions related to weather and climate are fundamentally regional to local. The climate change problem has been characterized as thousands of local vulnerabilities that are revealed by extreme weather events. And I think this is really pretty true, whether or not we have the slow creep of warming or not. Where I see a big role for AI and geospatial analytics is to analyze and adapt to the systemic risk from disruption by a weather hazard. Here's an example that I use in my book. In 2011, there was widespread flooding in Thailand triggered by a typhoon. This flooded the production plants around Bangkok, causing a year-long shortage of hard drives and many components essential for products manufactured in the US and Japan, including automobiles, electronics, and electric appliance. And I particularly remember the electrical appliance issues because we bought a new house in 2011, and I wanted to replace some electrical appliances, and you just couldn't get them. So, that seems rather astonishing that this was caused by a typhoon in Thailand. Actually, I think that blockchain could also be a useful technology to keep track of all the elements that feed into systemic risk from extreme weather events.
I don't mean this question to be political, so don't take it the wrong way, but I've gone down the rabbit hole and spent a lot of time studying these types of things just out of my own personal interest. And what I found is that the claim that and again, correct me if I'm wrong, but the claim that 97% of climate scientists agree that humans are the primary cause of climate change is widely cited in policy, media, corporate ESG strategies. However, at least some of the analyses I'm seeing are showing that this figure was derived by excluding studies that took no position, which significantly inflates the idea of consensus. And in fact, there are several reviews suggesting that less than 1% of papers explicitly attribute catastrophic warming primarily to human activity. So given how this statistic shapes public perception and business decisions, do you think that the consensus narrative has been misrepresented? And what are the implications for companies making long-term climate investments and risk assessments?
The so-called consensus on climate change is a manufactured consensus that's driven by the political goal of eliminating fossil fuels. This manufactured consensus hides the fact that there's substantial disagreement among scientists about some of the most consequential issues, like how much of the warming is human-caused versus natural, how the 21st century climate will play out, and whether warming is dangerous. Climate activists, the media, and politicians have greatly exaggerated the consensus for political objectives. Companies that are making long-term investments and risk assessments may be seriously misled, especially if they're using climate model outputs driven by the extreme emissions scenario.
Financial institutions and corporations, though, are increasingly using ESG metrics and climate risk scoring models, right? So based on your experience working with companies on ESG assessments, which aspects of these frameworks are genuinely useful, which are misleading and or even counterproductive?
I find some elements of ESG to be useful. On the environmental side, efficiency and resource use, minimizing waste and pollution, and adaptation to extreme weather events. These are all good. With regards to the climate change element of ESG, paying too much attention to greenhouse gas emissions can be damaging to a company if too much of the required power is provided by unreliable wind and solar. Further, focusing on greenhouse gas emissions can deflect resources away from more productive uses. Regulatory pressure is real, but under the Trump administration, I would expect the regulatory environment to change substantially. I've worked through the ESG requirements with several companies. None were able to identify a meaningful climate-related risk unless the extreme emissions scenario was used. However, since 2021, even the UN climate negotiators have abandoned the extreme emissions scenario as implausible.
Well, then when assessing climate risk, how should businesses differentiate between incremental risks, such as, let's say, gradual sea level rise, and emergency risks like hurricanes or droughts? And given that extreme weather events are more relevant to business resilience than slow climate shifts, I'm also wondering how companies should structure their risk management strategies and what role maybe AI could play in improving this kind of scenario-based planning.
Okay. The distinction between incremental risk and emergency risk is an important one. Incremental risks, such as sea level rise, are influenced by warming. However, the timescales in the oceans and ice sheets are very long. Even if the net zero targets are met, sea level could keep rising for another 2 centuries. On the other hand, emergency risk relates to extreme weather and climate events, such as hurricanes and drought, which have little to no relation to the warming. So managing these two different types of risk requires different strategies. Unless a company has significant coastal infrastructure with investment time horizons exceeding 50 years, I would prioritize the emergency risks. I would use the regional data-driven network-based approach to developing scenarios related to extreme weather risk. These scenarios can then be used to drive models that characterize the specific risks that the company is facing. As an example, my company has worked extensively with a major electric power provider in the Southeast US that's vulnerable to hurricanes. The scenarios we provide are used to drive outage models and as the basis for developing improved infrastructure and emergency management protocols.
The IPCC estimates that limiting warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius would require, I think it was $2.5 trillion per year in energy system investments through at least 2035. However, even with these efforts, many projections suggest that mitigation may only reduce warming by a few tenths of a degree by the end of the century. Given the massive capital investment required in the the ongoing need for reliable, affordable energy to sustain economic growth? Should businesses prioritize adaptation strategies such as resilient infrastructure over large-scale energy transitions? And how should companies or even maybe policymakers evaluate the ROI of climate-related investments to ensure the most effective use of resources?
Well, the cost-benefit calculus for the net zero plan of rapidly eliminating fossil fuel is very negative. Since the 2015 Paris Agreement, $9 trillion have been spent on the energy transition. And the percentage of energy provided by fossil fuels has dropped only slightly and still remains greater than 80%. So it's a low bar for adaptation strategies to provide a better ROI on investments.
The precautionary principle is often used to justify aggressive climate policies, and technology and AI overregulation due to worst case scenario thinking can stifle innovation. That's something I talked about with Julian Morris in a previous podcast. But how do you strike the right balance between precautionary measures and fostering adaptive, technology-driven solutions? And also to go back a little bit to an earlier point, how can AI and data-driven scenario planning help balance precaution with adaptability in climate-related business decisions?
Well, there's a fundamental tension between precaution and innovation. In my book, I describe the proactionary principle that seeks a balance. Rather than attempting to avoid the risk is embraced and managed through compensation and remediation. The proactionary principle valorizes calculated risk-taking as essential to human progress. I think that AI could help map out and understand better the systemic risk associated with an innovation, and that would help in this calculus. Earlier in the week, I was on a podcast in Germany, and one of the things we discussed was the differences between the US and Europe in handling risk. Europe is much more risk adverse than the US and emphasizes precaution, where the U.S. is more friendly to innovation. So this reflects, differences in political values and sort of trying to seek a balance here.
Your book also critiques I think you call it the predict then act approach in climate policy. Meanwhile, many businesses are shifting towards AI-driven real-time decision-making rather than long-term static forecasts. So what lessons can climate policy learn from AI-driven adaptive decision models that are used in the business world?
Well, businesses are far ahead of the national and international policymakers in using 21st century approaches to risk management. So in principle, much could be learned from the adaptive approaches used in businesses. However, I suspect the international UN agenda will be slow to change owing to the entrenched interests and priorities. But local and national governments are more likely candidates for the AI-driven adaptive decision approach.
Climate science is, as you know, probably better than anyone, has become, highly politicized. And I know you try to stay out of the political realm, but, this is still often leading to polarized debates. And given that business leaders have to navigate both these regulatory risks and the public perception, how should the companies balance the trade-off between actual climate risk and perceived risk when they're making investments and strategic decisions?
Well, this is a tough one. I work with a number of clients in the insurance sector and provide them with a realistic assessment of their risks from extreme weather and climate events. Their concern is that their investors are so heavily exposed to the alarmist hype and invested in it that they're always pushing them. But what about, I read this in the news and all of this kind of thing. So these companies need to walk a fine line. There's real risk, which is more related to natural variability. And then there's investment risk that responds to the perceptions of investors. The challenge here is the time horizon of the investment. For short-term investments such as catastrophe bonds, my clients make money by listening to me rather than to the public perception. This paid off for them during the 2024 Atlantic hurricane season, when my company nailed the seasonal forecast while all of the other forecast providers were substantially too high. I recently wrote a paper with Harry DeAngelis, professor of finance at USC. This paper is in press at the Journal of Corporate Finance. This is exactly the issue he's concerned with, of how to balance investments using the best objective estimate of reality versus the market perception. It's not a simple calculus.
You also wrote about the dangers of a climate catastrophe narrative. So from a business perspective, fear-based narratives often lead to reactionary policies rather than strategic investments in sustainability and resilience. So how should companies think about balancing risk communication with level-headed decision-making? The growing need of energy and the AI revolution really comes to mind here.
I think the fear-based narratives surrounding climate change have done substantial harm. They've drastically slowed down development in Africa and all but destroyed the industrial base in several European countries. We're currently at an inflection point on the climate change issue, largely driven by Trump and Malay, who've withdrawn from the Paris Climate Accords. It remains to be seen how influential this perspective will be in the international arena, but we are at an inflection point, it seems. AI is definitely driving the need for more electricity, and the Trump administration seems to be prioritizing this. We'll have to see how this plays out.
Water vapor, clouds, and other mechanisms or feedback mechanisms play a key role in determining climate sensitivity to CO2. Yet climate models still disagree by a factor of, I think, 3 on how much warming additional CO2 will actually cause. While extreme emission scenarios no longer seem likely, significant uncertainty remains around both future emissions and the strength of feedback effects. So I guess first, what is the reason behind the uncertainties? What range of warming should we realistically expect over the rest of the 21st century? And how should businesses approach, again, long-term climate risk assessments?
There's substantial uncertainty in climate model projections of warming, even for specified emissions scenario and natural climate forcing. The biggest deficiency in the climate models is clouds. And the problem here is the large range in the scales of the motions that are relevant to clouds, from global circulation patterns on down to small-scale turbulence. Without going into details, my best understanding is that climate sensitivity to CO2 is on the low end of the range provided by the IPCC. In terms of how much warming, I would look at the IPCC projections for the medium emission scenario at the bottom of their range. I would expect the CO2-driven warming for the remainder of the 21st century to be 1 degree centigrade or less. But the magnitude of natural climate variability could be as large or larger and headed in either direction. The main takeaway here is that the extreme predictions of 4 to 5 degrees centigrade of warming by 2100 are off the table. But there could be wild cards in terms of unpredictable natural climate variability that provides surprises. The eruption of the Hunga Tonga volcano a few years ago is one example, which has acted to provide a warming spike to the climate, since it had the unusual characteristics of pumping a lot of water vapor into the stratosphere. So, I'm sure there are other surprises in store for us over the next 75 years.
You also raised concerns about the feasibility of rapid, deep decarbonization strategies. Many businesses are investing, obviously, heavily in AI and automation to improve energy efficiency and operational resilience, which I think we agree are good things. From your perspective, though, should businesses be prioritizing emissions reduction, or are there alternative adaptation strategies that would yield better or greater long-term benefits? And what emerging technologies do you see as most impactful in this space?
Well, using AI and automation to improve energy efficiency and operational resilience sounds like a win-win strategy to me. Adaptation strategies generally have greater benefits than emissions reductions, particularly on decadal and shorter timescales. The sector that I'm most familiar with in terms of all of these advanced emerging technologies is the electric utilities sectors, where they're using all sorts of sensors and drones and sensor nets and smart local grids and very sophisticated processes trying to minimize electrical outages and excuse me. To minimize
Dr. Curry was nice enough to join us while sick as well. So thank you.
Yeah. I hope I don't sneeze too much. I lost my train of thought. Oh, and how to, rapidly restore electric power after an outage. So, there's a lot of sophisticated technology being brought to bear for that problem, and a lot of that's enabled by AI.
Increased CO2 levels enhance plant growth through CO2 fertilization, which can improve agricultural yields under certain conditions. However, factors such as nutrient availability, water supply, temperature extremes, and shifting climate patterns affect how effectively plants respond to elevated CO2. So given the rising global demand for food, how should businesses in both agriculture and, let's say, like the food supply chain more broadly assess the potential benefits and limitations of increased CO2 for long-term production and sustainability?
Well, this one's actually pretty simple. More CO2 in the atmosphere and warmer temperatures and more rain is good for vegetation, trees, and agriculture. Apart from some subtropical regions that may become drier, I don't see any downside for agriculture from increasing CO2. In recent decades, agricultural productivity has increased substantially against a background of warming.
If you had the opportunity to redesign global climate policy from scratch, then what innovations would you prioritize to improve climate adaptation and mitigation strategies?
Even if net zero policies successfully eliminated emissions, and if we believe the climate models, then we probably wouldn't notice any change to the climate or extreme weather events by the end of the 21st century, against the background of natural climate variability. I think we should abandon the global top-down approach of the Paris Agreement in favor of a bottom-up approach that focuses on regional, human-sized problems. We should abandon emissions targets and deadlines in favor of providing abundant energy for human development and advancement. We should conduct research and development towards deploying clean energy sources, such as advanced nuclear, and emphasize adaptation and increasing resilience to extreme weather events. Here's the deal. To quote our former president, we need to acknowledge that control is limited, the future is unknown, and it's difficult to determine whether the impact of our policies will be positive. We need to accept that climate change, whether human-caused or natural, will continue to disrupt natural systems and human well-being. By acknowledging that there's no road back, we can focus on the road ahead with new technologies.
In your final chapter, you discuss the need for a fresh approach to climate research. So what will be the most important areas of focus, and how do you see AI impacting the future of climate science and business risk modeling?
Climate science has been hijacked by political activists and a mediocre cadre of scientists who focus on analyzing extreme outcomes from climate models and to warn against adverse impacts. As a result, we've lost a generation of climate dynamicists who focus on trying to actually understand the complexities of the climate system. Climate scientists need to get back to the basics and do research in the hardcore atmospheric, oceanic, geologic, and solar sciences. The science policy interface has also been hijacked by political activists. Not only does this lead to poor policies, but it also interferes with the scientific process. At the science policy interface, I think the future lies in the so-called wicked science approaches. Wicked science is massively transdisciplinary, including natural science and engineering, along with social sciences and the humanities. Wicked science uses approaches from complexity science and systems thinking, but also include the experiential and operational knowledge of a range of stakeholders and decision makers. The wicked science approach acknowledges the complexities and uncertainties, and most importantly, the clashes in values. And it abandons the idea of control and moral and political coercion in favor of greater understanding and reducing vulnerability. I see AI as an important component of wicked science, particularly in analyzing systemic risk and designing risk management protocols. So, this is a new way of looking at the problem, but I think it's exciting and holds promise for helping us better address our challenges.
Final question, Dr. Curry. You've dedicated your career to untangling complex climate data, battling the uncertainty monster, and challenging, again, pseudoscientific kind of mainstream narratives, right? So be honest. What's harder, predicting long-term climate shifts or predicting how people will react when you tell them the world isn't ending in 10 years?
Oh, one is rational and then the other is irrational. I can deal with the rational and I do my best to ignore the irrational. But there's a great middle ground of people who don't know what to think about this issue. Okay, and that's my real audience. I'm trying to, and it's not just about giving them facts, it's about, my book tries to, I don't solve any problems in my book, either scientifically or policy, but the point of my book is to broaden how we think about these problems, and to understand the source of the disagreements, why we disagree, the uncertainties, and some strategies for how we can move forward on this in the face of uncertainty and disagreement. So to the extent that I can get an audience for that perspective, I think I'm, gaining some ground. But it's a much more complicated narrative than a simple, it's warming, we're causing it, it's dangerous, we better get rid of the fossil fuels. That's a very simple story and it scares people into action, but it's just not a useful narrative, frankly, if we're trying to move the human race forward in terms of security and prosperity.
I agree. And I hope people recognize that watch this, that Dr. Curry is not a political figure. She's been offered government jobs. She has nothing and wants nothing to do with DC. She's just interested in the fact, the science, the logic, the reason here. And, I hope that business leaders watching this understand and take her message to heart. And, it can help, create better economies or better businesses in the future. So, Dr. Curry, thank you for your time. I very much appreciate it. Any last words?
Yeah, just maybe one. I'd add to what you just said. What really makes me tick right now is helping businesses and local government agencies figure out how to manage their weather and climate-related risk through better forecasts and better decision support approaches. So that's sort of what makes me tick right now. And I think, some of them, and this takes me into many different sectors and looking at many different problems, but that it's really very interesting. And I think AI has a big role to play in this realm moving forward.
Thank you, Dr. Curry.
Thanks, Chris. As always, a pleasure.